The Colombian sun is something special that IT doesn't press down on you or burn like it does in Nevada. It wraps you in gentle light, like a warm blanket. Everything here feels different. Here, I don't wake up to an alarm. I wake up to birds outside my window arguing over a palm tree. Here, mornings don't smell of bleach and metallic dust, but of coffee, ripe fruit, and the rain that always comes by evening. That I like it here that I work at a small private lab on the outskirts of Medellin. Chemical analysis, sample testing, occasional synthesis, nothing complicated in 1,000-page reports, no one breathing down my neck, no non-disclosure agreements. Work the way it should be. For money, for peace of mind, without the shadows of underground corridors. Sometimes, sure, I get hit by nostalgia. Sometimes I look through a microscope at a drop of blood and remember trying to decipher the composition of alien bioplasma 6 years ago. In a windowless lab a kilometer beneath the earth. But that feels like a memory from another life, like it happened to someone else. Some character in a sci-fi movie who watched too many conspiracy theories and lost his grip on reality. But no, that was me. And it all really happened. Sometimes, when I'm sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, a strange thought crosses my mind. What if I actually died back then? In that capsule, in that burst of light. And now I'm living in some alternate dream, a spare reality granted to me for a good deed? But then a motorcycle rumbles past. Someone yells in Spanish about discounts on avocados, and the world becomes real again. Life goes on. 6 years ago, I was a different man. Same name, same hands, same eyes, but I was too naive. I thought science was always about seeking truth. I believed that serving knowledge was noble, that if you were trusted with a secret, it meant you were worthy. And then I was transferred to Zone 52.at first. I took the assignment as a promotion. In the silence and secrecy, it felt like I was becoming part of something monumental, and maybe I was. Only that monumental came with the smell of formaldehyde and cold metal doors. That we worked in total isolation. Even thoughts had to be filtered in a Wi-Fi. No windows, no time, only lighting shifts and the hum of ventilation. Like an underground sea, they were really there. 3 of them. That we called them subjects, specimens, entities. Anything to avoid admitting the obvious. They were alive and intelligent, and they understood more than we gave them credit for. I don't want to recall all of it. Not yet. Sometimes, I just need to remind myself why I'm here. Why I'm not in the US, not in Las Vegas where it all began, but in Colombia, where thunderstorms light up the hills each evening. And in the mornings, mangoes the size of a child's head appear at the market. I'm here because this is freedom, because I proved I deserved to remain human, because those we called specimens turned out to be more human than many people I knew, and because they repaid me with kindness. Now I live a different life, with a different name, with documents that passed 5 levels of scrutiny, with a bank account no one can trace, with a passport that shows my photo, but someone else's past. Sometimes I wonder if I made it all up, if I just ran from the old life and invented a fairy tale to justify my fear. But then I look up at the sky, and if you watch carefully, at sunset, you might see something faint, shimmering between the clouds. It doesn't look like a satellite. It doesn't move. It just is. I smile, sip my coffee, go back to the lab reports. My life now is simple. Clean. No secrets. Almost. Sometimes it all begins with a folder. Thick, gray, unmarked. Not even a paperclip, just sheets inside. Heavy as a verdict. I found one like that at my workstation on an ordinary, unremarkable morning. Back then, I was still working at a research center on the outskirts of Las Vegas. The center focused on applied chemistry, mostly for energy corporations. Everything seemed routine but respectable. Until the folder arrived. Inside were just 3 sheets. The first was an invitation to participate in a special project. No title, no logos. Just a code designation, coordinates, and the signature of someone whose existence I'd only heard about in rumors. The second sheet was a transfer notice, and the third, The third would later be called the point of no return. A non-disclosure agreement, written in such a way that even if I wanted to break it, I wouldn't know how to put it into words. That I sat with that folder like it was a one-way ticket. Inside, everything was boiling, fear and excitement alike. I was 29, had no family, no debt, no strong attachments. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something huge, too huge to turn away from. The next morning, men in black suits came for me. It wasn't some Hollywood-style Area 51 abduction with a bag over my head. Everything was perfectly polite. They led me to a van with tinted windows, offered me water, and calmly explained that part of the route will continue underground. I remembered those last words especially clearly, that we drove for a long time. Asphalt gave way to dust, then to rocks. I felt the wheels scrape over a metal surface. Then it was as if we entered a massive mine shaft. Another hour passed, and the vehicle stopped. They asked me to get out. An elevator. Cold, tall, like the kind used to launch rockets. We descended, slowly and silently. "Welcome to Zone 52, the escort said. His voice was devoid of emotion, like a subway announcer. I thought it was a joke, I muttered. Many do. At first, they issued me a uniform, a white coat, a nameless badge reading simply Analyst, Level 3. I went through a medical exam, fingerprinting, retina scan. They even checked my tongue. Everything was strict, without smiles. I asked questions, got one-word answers. Not allowed. Not yet. You'll find out. But the strangest thing was, I wasn't afraid. On the contrary, I felt a deep certainty inside. I was heading towards something real. Not paper experiments for grant money, not routine work for reports, but something genuine, forbidden, almost mythical. That first night, they gave me a private room, sterile white, with a bed, a sink, and a built-in terminal. No internet, but I could read an internal library of scientific and technical reference texts. I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought, what are they hiding here? What's so secret it has to be buried under a kilometer of rock? On the second day, they showed me the laboratories. At first, nothing special. Analyzers, chromatographs, spectrometers. I was almost disappointed. But then they took me to a separate sector. The doors were thicker there, the lighting softer, the security doubled. And that's where I first heard the word, whispered between two senior lab technicians, biosubjects. 3. Still breathing. I didn't ask what they meant. I didn't need to. I already knew. This wasn't just a zone. This was the boundary between what we accept as possible and what's hidden even from the word belief. That's how it all began. You feel the depth with your body when you breathe in, and the air gives no coolness because it has long passed through filters saturated with chlorine and passed through again. When your footsteps echo dully in the walls, as if there's not empty space around you, but millions of tons of stone. When sounds are muffled, as if the world here vibrates below the frequency of a whisper. That's when you understand you're truly underground. Zone 52 isn't a facility. It's a whole world. Self-sufficient, autonomous, sealed off. A system of underground compartments, galleries, shafts, decontamination zones, and airlocks. All of it buried 1,180 meters beneath the Nevada desert. Somewhere above lies Zone 51, the one they let journalists and UFO hunters into. But down here lies what never sees the surface, neither literally nor figuratively. I was led through 3 security checkpoints. Biometrics, psych tests, interrogations. At the entrance, I had to leave everything of mine behind. Watch, phone, lighter, even a notebook. In exchange, a tablet with encrypted access, a uniform, and a strictly limited access zone. They gave me a badge, Level 3, Clearance C-. What does C- mean? I asked the escort. Controlled minus, he replied. You don't have direct access to the biosubjects. Yet, only analytics, lab data, behavioral protocols. Biosubjects. He looked at me like I had asked the wrong question, then nodded slowly. You're here because of them. We all are. My first impression of Zone 52 wasn't fear. It was awe. This place breathed control, brilliance, and something almost sacred. Vast corridors bathed in soft light. Walls polished smooth, like stone carved by machines. The air sterile, as if even the idea of bacteria had been scrubbed away. Delivery bots moved along narrow tracks beneath the floors. Automated kitchens, showers, even recreation rooms. Everything ran like clockwork, but there were very few people. Strikingly few. I started to realize that there were no shifts here in the usual sense. No one came from outside. Everyone I saw lived here. For good, or for a long time. I heard whispers. Someone had spent 20 years in the zone without once going topside, and had asked not to be taken out. At first, the place reminded me of a space station. Everything functional, precise, quiet. But after a day, I began to feel something else. Not isolation, but selection. As if the zone itself chose who could stay and who would break. You couldn't shout here. You couldn't be fully yourself. You had to be useful. They assigned me to Sector B2, near the analytics division. The room was standard, hard bed, sink, terminal. No window, of course. Something hummed softly behind the wall, as if a network of cables, thick as tree trunks, pulsed beneath us. Maybe it really did. In the lab, I started as an assistant. My tasks were routine, sample checks, report logging, biochemical marker analysis. Nothing extraordinary. Until I saw words in the protocols like neuropolymorphic response and adaptive cellular memory. You don't use those terms for studying. Mice. And then came the dreams. On the third day, I saw 3 of them. Vague silhouettes in a dim room. One stood motionless, as if asleep with eyes open. Another sat and stared at me. And the third reached out a hand. And I felt a subtle prick in my mind. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing like I'd sprinted up 100 flights of stairs. Back then, I didn't know those 3 were real. That they had names. That they were waiting. I just stared at the ceiling of my sterile room, trying to understand what the hell was happening here. That I knew they existed. Protocols, references in the reports, encrypted data, all of it pointed to the presence of the biosubjects. But knowing is one thing. Seeing is something else entirely. It happened on the 6th day. I was summoned to Sector D. My escort offered. No explanation, only said, "Follow me and don't ask questions." The elevator descended even deeper, beyond the level mentioned in my clearance zone. At the door stood armed guards in hermetic helmets. A biometric panel, a code phrase, a retinal scan. The door opened, and everything changed. The room wasn't a lab. It felt more like living quarters. White wall panels. Soft, sourceless light. No sharp corners. 3 transparent compartments, like greenhouses, and inside them, they were there. The 3. My first impression wasn't fear. Not even it was silence, mental, emotional, as if the background noise inside my head had been switched off. They were calm, taller than a human, slightly, slender, flexible, their movements precise but never hurried. Their skin had a pale ash tone, with a subtle texture, like stone worn smooth by time. Their eyes were dark, featureless, deep, not frightening, more like tired. They stood motionless, in their compartments, each in their own space. Occasionally, one would turn its head slightly, observing. One of them sat on the floor, legs folded in a posture reminiscent of meditation. The second had stepped close to the transparent wall. The third didn't move at all. "These are them," said my escort. E17, R4, and the one with no identifier. Sometimes we call him Zero. How long have they been here? Since 1947. More than 70 years. They've never tried to? Not once. We're not even sure they understand they're confined, or maybe they just don't see it as confinement. I stepped closer. R4, the one by the wall, tilted his head. His gaze lingered on me. Not like an animal. Not like a human. Something else. I felt like I was in the palm of his hand. Not physically. Mentally. As if he was weighing not my body, but my thoughts. "Do they communicate?" I asked, facial expressions, gestures, sometimes sounds like speech, but never actual words. They understand us. Quite possibly. Then again, maybe we're the ones who don't understand. The room felt like a time museum. These three had been here long before I was born, before my parents were born. Watching, absorbing, waiting. They weren't enemies, but calling them friends didn't feel right either. They simply were. And that alone was enough. Our force slowly raised a hand. A simple gesture. Fingers brought together, then spread apart. I had no idea what it meant. But for some reason, I wanted to do the same. I raised my hand, copied him. The silence thickened. No one behind me laughed. No one stopped me. Someone simply whispered, "Don't be afraid. They know when you're lying." I wasn't lying. I just stood there, watching, feeling. These beings, they were old, not frail, ancient. Their posture, their gaze, their breath, everything about them said they had lived far longer than we could imagine, and they were still waiting for something. "They're not hostile," my escort said as we left. "We're used to them. And, it seems, they're used to us. Sometimes the lab techs play cards with them. Sometimes they just sit nearby." "They have names?" I asked. They did. Informal ones, given by the first lab staff. Almost forgotten by now. "But, if you're curious," he smiled. "The one who sits, they called him L, the one by the glass, Navi, and the still one, Jazz. Humanoids, observed. Or perhaps, the other way around?" I already knew their names. L, the elder one, with the most expressive facial reactions. Navi, the silent one, skin tinged with indigo, always distant. Jazz, the most alive, often mimicking the staff's movements, as if playing a game. But it wasn't until my 5th week on the job that I realized these weren't just nicknames we had made up with colleagues. These names had been given to them almost 80 years ago by the very first people who saw them in 1947. I discovered this by accident. I was sitting in the archival section, sorting old physical journals while the system updated. One of the handbound volumes contained personal notes from a duty lab technician of that era. The handwriting was large and flowing. The ink faded, but the text was still legible. We decided to name them ourselves. Makes it easier. They don't mind. The first, L. There's a symbol on a scrap of cloth on his outfit, like the letter L. The second, Navi. His skin has a bluish tint, like the depths of the sea. The third, Jazz. His movements are chaotic, but rhythmic. Like music without notes. I ran my fingers across the lines. Everything matched. Later, back in the residential sector, I brought it up carefully over dinner. 2 technicians and the cook, someone we trusted more than the station psychologist, were at the table. "Did you know those names were given to them back in 47? "Of course," said one of the techs without even looking up from his tray. "It's unofficial, but all the old-timers here know that. They've been with us longer than we've been with ourselves," added the second. "Without them, there wouldn't even be a station." "Funny how we talk about them like neighbors," I said. "They are neighbors," the cook shrugged. "We don't bring them pies, sure, but Jazz, we've got footage of him copying one of the operators, even mimicked his walk. Funny guy." That's when it hit me. They had become part of daily life. So much so that neither the guards nor the scientists ever referred to them impersonally. They weren't just subjects, not just outsiders. Elle would sit for hours without moving, but reacted instantly to changes in light. Navi seemed to listen when we spoke in his presence, tilting his head ever so slightly. Jazz played, tried to understand our gestures, our expressions, sometimes even smiled. Almost like a human. The next day, I deliberately stopped by the central observation room. All 3 were in their usual spots. Elle by the wall, Jazz on the floor as if resting, Navi standing still, facing the glass that I tapped on the reinforced barrier. Jazz turned and nodded. And it wasn't just mimicry. It was recognition. "Hi, Jazz," I said quietly. He placed a hand on his chest, then pointed at me. "My name is," I started, but trailed off. Why was I doing this? What was I trying to prove? But Jazz had already turned away, as if he understood everything and didn't need words. Names were enough that IT first. Everything was strict. Glass walls, observation logs, protocols, and no touching. No speaking without clearance. Everything by the manual. Subjects G1, G2, and G3 under minimal intervention surveillance. But manuals age fast, especially when you watch Jazz yawn right after you do. Not in sync, but a few seconds later. As if testing a theory. You see that? I once asked Griff, one of the techs. See what? He's copying us. Movements, expressions. It can't be random. Maybe they've got mirror neurons too. Who knows? We call them humanoids for a reason, not space lizards. And that's how it started, tiny experiments. Not by order, not for data, out of boredom, out of curiosity, out of a quiet need to understand who, or what, they really were that we started leaving objects in their chamber. Balls, colored cubes, simplified toys. Jazz was the first to show interest. He spun the cubes, lined them up, turned them into triangles. We tried giving him hints, nudging patterns. He'd lose interest quickly, as if help bored him. L, on the other hand, remained reserved, rarely touched anything, mostly observed. Especially when someone laughed or argued nearby, that he'd tilt his head slightly, as if listening in. Navi was the hardest to read. He barely reacted to anything. But one day, while Griff was playing an old Ella Fitzgerald vinyl in the break room, Navi froze. That he stood by the glass, motionless, not looking at us, looking through us, somewhere far. After that, we started playing music more often. The experiment turned into habit. Sometimes even a form of evening entertainment. Jazz would try to move with the rhythm, not dancing, exactly, but something that we even set up a few game sessions. I drew a simple tic-tac-toe board with magnetic pieces. Jazz learned the rules in 2 days. Elle played once and never came back to the table. Navi just watched. The psychologists were thrilled. Early signs of communication. They wrote in their reports. But those of us who lived down there for months had a different take. It's not us teaching them, Dr. Martinez said one evening. They're choosing what's worth learning and giving us only what they want to give. He was right. There was no sense of training, more like polite participation. As if they were allowing us to do what we wanted. Even when Jazz spoke for the first time. It was simple. He pointed at a game piece, then at me, then at himself. We understood. He was asking to play. I didn't call anyone from the science division. We just played. He won. Repeatedly. Strange, but on nights like that, Zone 52 didn't feel like a prison. It felt more like a club of old acquaintances. Too strange to ever fully understand, but too familiar to keep calling subjects. At some point, I caught myself looking at Elle and wondering, did he have a family? Somewhere, back where he came from. Maybe Jazz really had played these kinds of games before, not with us, but with someone who once waited for him. And Navi. Maybe he was homesick. We couldn't ask, and they didn't answer. But every time one of them nodded in response to a gesture, or touched a toy, or simply held a gaze just a second longer, it felt like something inside them was slowly reaching outward, not human, but alive. And that alone was enough to start trusting them. Or at least, to stop being afraid. This all feels like a reversed zoo, Peter Hale once muttered, junior behavioral analyst, chewing on a protein bar, eyes on nothing in particular. Only this time, we're the ones behind the glass. He said it offhandedly, not really, expecting a response. But I knew immediately, he wasn't just joking. Not entirely. I smirked. Yeah, sure. Meanwhile, they're writing reports in their system. Subject H, 23 demonstrates recurring cognitive bias. Exactly, he nodded. Look at how they look. Not just staring. They analyze. They remember. Take L. That stare of his could burn through walls. Like he knows when you're lying before you even speak. I waved him off. Peter had a tendency to spiral, especially after 3 consecutive night shifts. But the joke lingered. Settled in. The next day, I tried something different. I looked at them not as test subjects, not as G1, G2, and G3. But as observers, watching us, L really did have a way of looking, direct, but not hostile. Sometimes it felt like he wasn't reading your face. He was reading through it'd as if every hand movement betrayed an intent, and every word hit a deeper layer. Jazz. Jazz seemed to enjoy our attempts to decipher him. His eyes lit up whenever we showed him something new. Once, I brought a set of optical illusions, simple black and white prints with distorted shapes. Jazz flipped through them slowly, studying, then turned one around and held it up toward us, watching our reaction carefully. As if to ask, "Do you get it?" Because I do. But the strangest moment was with Navi. He rarely moved, avoided eye contact. Yet one evening, when I was left alone with him, I just talked about my childhood, my university days, the first time I saw a chemical reaction under a microscope, and he tilted his head slightly, blinked once, slowly, deliberately, as if to say, "I'm listening." After that day, I never laughed at Peter's joke again, not because I was scared, but because I started to wonder if he was right. They were aging. You could tell, especially Navi. His skin had dulled, his movements grown sluggish, but in his eyes, the same intensity, the same sharp focus. Griff and I had a quiet debate once. "You think they're smarter than us?" "I don't know," he said, "but definitely not less intelligent. Just different, not linear. They don't learn like we do. They accumulate, they watch, they compare, and maybe they already figured out who the real test subjects are." We laughed, but not like before, not freely. Later, walking past the chamber corridor, I caught myself thinking, how often have I been under observation? How many hours have they spent tracking every word, every reaction, every microexpression? And more importantly, why? They didn't seem hostile, not angry, more like patient, like they knew something would change eventually, and they were simply waiting for it, passing the time with their study. Maybe it was never a lab, maybe it was an enclosure, and if it was a zoo, then, just like Peter said, the cages were on our side of the glass. It started subtly. Jazz began sitting longer, moving less. A faint tremor appeared in his fingers. In any other case, we'd call it aging, material fatigue. But Jazz wasn't human, and yet his body said it plainly. Time was passing. At first, we didn't think much of it, but we assumed it was a reaction to the lighting cycles, maybe stress, maybe a drop in temperature. We ran all the checks. Everything came back normal, but Jazz stopped responding to stimuli. His gaze unfocused, his movements sluggish. When Elle approached and placed a hand on his shoulder, Jazz didn't even look at him, just gave a faint nod, as if saying goodbye. The next day, he was isolated, and no announcements. No urgency. Two figures in full protective suits opened the airlock, stepped in, and took him away, silently. Elle and Navi watched the whole thing. I saw the tension in their faces, or what we called faces. They didn't resist, didn't move, but in their eyes, unmistakable recognition. I didn't sleep that night, that we weren't close. How could you be close to a being that never speaks? Still, I felt a kind of emptiness. A pressure in the chest, like the vacuum outside the glass had slipped in. They placed Jazz in section B3, a sealed chamber with full life support. They monitored him around the clock. I found a way into the ventilation duct. I just wanted to see. He was lying still, as if asleep. His face, if you could call it a face, had gone stone-like. The pale veins beneath the skin had dimmed to nothing. 24 hours later, he was gone. There was no drama, no alarms, no rushing medics, just a display screen fading to gray. The label at the bottom changed from stable to inactive. That was it. That's what death looked like. The autopsy, though, that was something else entirely. The team was assembled fast. 7 people, including the lead neurophysiologist and 2 committee observers. I wasn't supposed to be there, but one of the toxicology staff didn't show. They called me in as a backup. We entered the white zone under full isolation. Jazz lay on the table, body neatly secured. His skin had turned pale gray, like old metal. Inside, We saw something no one expected. His organs were perfectly symmetrical, immaculately ordered, and no signs of inflammation. No decay, no structural damage. Everything looked alive, biologically. Someone murmured behind me, "He shouldn't be dead." Not yet. But he was that. We collected tissue samples, extracted internal structures, sent them off for analysis. Point one of the scanners detected a faint energy emission, subtle fluctuations at the subcellular level, AS, if the tissue remembered life. Within a day, we learned this. Inside Jazz's brain was a structure resembling a neural reactor, a kind of biological processor generating microfields. He wasn't just thinking. He was transmitting, sending something, maybe even connecting. But with whom? This could change everything, the overseers said. If we can understand the mechanism. I said nothing, because I was looking at Elle and Navi. They sat silently, in their chambers, unmoving, composed. But they never broke eye contact. That I felt it on my back like heat. They knew everything. And maybe they also understood. It was someone else's turn now. The second phase of the autopsy unfolded in a far more charged atmosphere. The tissue analysis from Jazz had begun to yield results, and each new microscopic slice stirred something between reverence and cold hunger in the room. Particular attention fell on a small, barely visible structure hidden deep within the cranial cavity. That it wasn't a tumor, nor was it part of any known anatomy. A dense, faintly glowing mass, like a compressed bundle of optical fibers, roughly the size of a grape. "What is that?" asked one of the bioengineers, looking up from the holographic scan. "No idea," replied the section chief. But it wasn't just there. It was active. Initial spectral imaging revealed pulsed energy emissions, not electrical, not chemical. These were fluctuations in microspace. None of the standard models could explain it. And yet, the structure responded to radiation at specific frequencies, AS, if we had stumbled upon something alive, but not biological, and at the same time, biological, but not alive. "It could be a biokey," someone said quietly. The word stuck instantly. Biokey, a word that carried billions in funding, military contracts, and long-buried experiments in organic technology capable of unlocking systems we hadn't even built yet, or had already lost. He was a carrier, one of the analysts concluded. Possibly a device, or memory, or an interface. A strange silence settled over the lab. You could almost hear the mental gears turning. Everyone reordering power structures in their heads. If this turned out to be real. A few hours later, confirmation arrived. The biostructure reacted to fields of a specific frequency, but only once. One query. One response. Inside, they found fragments of structured chains, resembling genetic code, but belonging to no known form of life. It was all too precise, too intentional. The morning briefing, the department head stated plainly, "We have in our hands an organic medium of a fundamentally new type, possibly a universal code. It can be adapted for medical use, for tissue reconstruction. Or used as a biological key to activate systems. And possibly," he paused, "weapons." This was no longer research. This was a race. That we weren't competing with other nations. We were racing against a possible future, and whatever came with it. Containment was intensified. No records, no external connections, even interdepartmental communications required dual authentication and verifier clearance. The samples were being prepared for transport to Site B-12, a classified facility in Alaska. But something kept nagging at me. That same night, I looked at Elle and Navi again. They sat in silence. But now their silence held no anticipation, only unease. As if they felt it, as if they knew. We had found something we were never meant to find, crossed a line we weren't supposed to cross. And that's when the thought hit me for the first time. Maybe Jazz didn't die naturally. Maybe he shut himself down. They gathered us all at 09:00. No warning. No usual bureaucratic preamble. The briefing began with a sentence that made my mouth go dry. "Next is L." No one flinched or they pretended not to. Jazz, already dead, had given us more than we ever dared to hope for. Now, naturally, in their minds, it was time to dissect the second, compare, confirm, look for patterns, and if we got lucky, open a new chapter in biotechnology. But a cold sweat broke across my back that I remembered how L played with bits of plastic, arranging them into neat shapes. How he tilted his head in response to tone. How he smiled. Not a real smile. Maybe. But it meant something. He understood. And now, we were going to cut him open. We begin the procedure tomorrow, the department head said. Prepare Block B, clear the documentation, update the control protocols. I sat frozen. My thoughts swirled like water down a drain. Everything was moving too fast. Jazz had barely cooled, and we were already moving on to the next. The machine was running now, cold, unstoppable. After the meeting, I went to the observation sector, just to look. Navi sat against the far wall. L was in his usual spot, calm as ever, but the moment I stepped in, Navi lifted his eyes. He looked straight at me, not with fear, not with hostility, just directly to AS if he knew. AS if he were asking. What are you going to do? I looked away, faked a few notes on my tablet, pretended to be busy. But inside, the panic had begun to spread. I couldn't let this happen. Back in the break room, I tried to calm myself. I drank tea, turned on white noise. Nothing helped. The thought pounded in my skull. They understand everything. They have, from the beginning. And then I remembered, a few days ago, Navi had run his fingers along the wall, not idly, in a patterned AS if he were tracing something, writing something. Back then, I dismissed it as strange motor behavior. Now, it felt like a signal. I returned to the lab. Under the guise of an inspection, I entered Block B and looked into the cell. L raised his eyes. They were serene to AS if he had already accepted it. I stepped closer to the glass. No words, no gestures, just the overwhelming sense that beneath his stillness was something far greater. Then Navi came closer. Very slowly. He stood beside L and gently placed a hand on his shoulder and looked at me again. It was a silent conversation. Not just we know. It was, you know too. You can stop this. I left the chamber trembling. Everything I had studied, every protocol, every scientific principle, suddenly felt too narrow. We didn't understand who we were keeping behind the glass. And I knew, if I didn't act now, tomorrow would be too late. I barely slept that night. One thought kept circling in my head. How? How do you tell a being that doesn't speak that death is coming? How do you make it understand that the clock is ticking and that you are ready to change something? At dawn, while the others were just beginning to stir, I slipped into the observation sector. The duty tech was dozing over his tablet. The cameras were recording into silence. I walked up to the glass. Navi was already standing there, as if he had been waiting. They want to cut L open, I said softly, knowing he couldn't hear me, but hoping something, some part of it, might reach him. Navi didn't move. Tomorrow. I don't want him to, I faltered, to die like that. We know you understand. Still no response. A minute passed. Then another. I was about to turn away when he raised his hand. With 3 fingers, he traced a loop in the air, then pressed his palm against the glass. Slowly, using his nail, he etched a series of symbols into the mirrored surface. Precise. Deliberate. Coordinates? No. Too short. A frequency? Most likely. And the numbers next to it, 74.7. Looked far too much like megahertz. I pulled out my tablet, snapped a photo, then copied it by hand just in case. He watched me the whole time, unblinking. Then came the next movement, smooth, intentional. As if he were instructing. A rectangular shape. An antenna? A module? He sketched the outline in the air, then added a short stroke at the top, indicating upward. Transmission. A radio modulator. You want a transmitter? I breathed, stepping closer. Navi tilted his head slightly, not a nod. Not quite. Agreement. But something. I left without saying goodbye. My whole body was shaking. From adrenaline, from fear, from the overwhelming realization that something had just happened, something outside the protocol we had communicated, for real, back. In the break room, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. What now? Getting a transmitter tuned to the right frequency wasn't going to be easy. Here in Zone 52, everything was monitored, every wire. Every chip had a serial number, but we had old equipment stored in the technical archive, obsolete, decommissioned, but still functional. That was my way in. Around midday, I made my move. Used the pretense of checking insulation units to enter the storage section. Dust. Old crates. Forgotten machines. But the device I needed was right there. Third shelf, same spot as 6 years ago. Back when we first tested it for Project Mirror Relay that we didn't need it then. But now, we had a chance that I hid the module beneath my lap. Coveralls like a smuggler carrying eternity. Returned to the observation sector by evening. The cameras were still on. But the recording ran with a delay. Navi was there again. I didn't say anything. Just walked up to the glass, crouched down to be level with him, and slowly, very slowly, pulled out the device, held it in my palm like an offering. He stepped forward, raised his hands, point two open palms, then a subtle gesture inward. Bring it to me. I nodded. Tomorrow I'd slip the module into the cell. I'd find a way. He knew. And it seemed. He believed. Everything came down to today. Ever since Navi showed me the frequency and the design, I knew there was no turning back. Not because I was afraid. I wasn't. But because, for the first time, I felt they had a plan. That they weren't broken. That they weren't just waiting. And I was part of that plan. Theft inside Zone 52. It was nearly unthinkable. They claimed everything here was under control. Equipment, air, even thoughts. But I'd long since figured out the flaws. In the system, too many security layers. Too few people. No one could truly monitor it all, not around the clock. Especially not the old tech archives. I had the modulator already. Now I needed the antenna. Not just any metal mesh, a compact, directional antenna capable of shortwave uplink, preferably portable. And I knew exactly where to find it. There was one place, an old research container where prototype drone models had been gathering dust for years. Practically a museum. It wasn't off limits. But no one ever went there anymore. No one left to care. The guard at the checkpoint gave a lazy wave as I signed the log. Back to the archive again, Jake? He yawned. Yeah, looking for a thermal sensor. Might repurpose something for the main project, I said without slowing. Inside, silence. The smell of dust and grease. Rows of shelves tangled in wires, drone shells. Abandoned schematics. I knew right where it was. A small case labeled S-band uplink. Test only. A prototype. Never officially activated. 0.9 minutes. Entrance to exit. That was the window I gave myself. Everything timed. The antenna fit easily under my jacket. It was just bigger than a palm, with a collapsible frame. Weight about the same as a tablet. Everything was going according to plan. Now, the real task. Delivery. The humanoid containment chamber was in a restricted sector, no access without an escort. But I'd made a habit of dropping in for routine checks, behavioral monitoring, sensor recalibration, sample collection, all properly logged, all made to look like protocol. Today, luck was on my side. One of the junior techs had snapped a sensor mount. I was on the maintenance list. Perfect timing. I entered. L and Navi were inside. Calm. Too calm. The sensor was genuinely damaged. I showed the tech how to resolder the connection, then asked him to step out. Manual calibration required, and the EM interference from two bodies throws the readings. He nodded and left. The door sealed behind him. 0.3 minutes. That's what I had. I crossed to the right-hand corner, near the wall, where the shadow from the vent grill hid the base paneling. Pulled the modulator and antenna from my pocket, fixed them in place with magnetic clamps, and activated standby mode. Navi approached. He said nothing, as always, but his eyes were sharp, focused, not on me, on the device. I gave a small nod. He returned it. A real nod. The first one. Link established. I walked out 5 minutes later, telling the guards the sensor had been fully calibrated. It was just a connector issue. No one asked questions. That evening, I sat alone in the break room, staring at the blank terminal screen. They would send the signal. Where? I had no idea. What would happen next? I didn't know. But I knew the bridge was built, and now it was up to them. It happened 57 minutes after I activated the transmitter that I was sitting in the lab, pretending to be absorbed in data analysis. The screen in front of me blinked with a standard radiation chart, but I wasn't really seeing it. One thought filled my mind. Will they hear it? Will they come? When? The answer came sooner than expected. First, the feed from the containment chamber went out. It didn't just cut. It froze, flickered, then went dark. A siren echoed in the corridor. Not an alarm, but a system alert. Sensor. Failure. Power fault. 5 seconds later, something impossible happened. In the ceiling of the chamber where Elle and Navi were held. A dome opened. Not physically. It was as if space itself became transparent. I saw it through a secondary channel. Someone in security had tapped into the internal network, and the feed briefly appeared on the central monitor. Several people jumped up. What the hell? Someone muttered. But no one knew what they were looking at. A beam descended from the ceiling. Vertical, silent, blue-white, like a column of condensed light. It didn't pulse. It didn't shimmer. It stood there, dense and unwavering, like glass, like ice, like something alive. El lifted his head. Navi was already beneath the beam. Their bodies rose, not quickly, but smoothly, almost regally. Gravity had released them. They had shifted into another state of being, one that no longer obeyed our laws. Someone screamed. Security. Two armed guards burst into the room. Too late. Navi vanished first, absorbed into the beam. El lingered a moment, turned, looked down, toward the camera, toward where he knew I'd be watching. I didn't know if he saw me, but I felt that look. A farewell. Or an invitation. Then, he, too, dissolved into light. The beam vanished. Only dust fell from the ceiling. No debris. No residue. Just an empty room with faint marks from cryo systems and 2 vacant bunks. The silence was deafening. The alarm didn't sound until 30 seconds later. The system hadn't understood what had happened by the time the emergency protocols kicked in. Cameras locked. Doors sealed. The humanoids were gone. They had left. They did it. They called me in for questioning almost immediately. As the last technician to have interacted with the subjects, I was prepared. When you exited the isolation chamber, were Elle and Navi still present? The voice across the table was cold, clinical. They were. I nodded. I repaired the sensor, closed the door, signed off on the protocol. Did you notice anything unusual? No. They were calm, as usual. Moved even less than they normally do. All true. Mostly, they didn't suspect me. Not yet. But the tension in the complex was rising. Access levels were being re-evaluated, security doubled, camera logs pulled, backups under forensic review. But there was one thing they didn't know. The link was already active. They were gone. And this was only the beginning. I didn't make it back to my quarters after Elle and Navi vanished. The complex buzzed like a disturbed hive. People ran through corridors, doors slammed shut automatically. The ventilation roared at maximum capacity, and all of it was accompanied by a sensation, almost physical, that the air had grown heavier. If the building itself had begun to feel the end approaching, I knew I had to get out when the central security panel started flashing red code. That had never happened in all my years of service here. The gravel lift. That was only the first act. I sprinted toward the upper node, a technical shaft access point where local sensor arrays could still be reached. There was a console there. We used to monitor seismic activity and gravitational fields. What I saw made me freeze. A spike. A dense, compressed wave of mass, coming from above, not an explosion. A compression of space itself. Not a weapon, but a tool. A scalpel, precisely aimed at the heart of the facility. From orbit. A gravity cannon. I turned and our AN AT that exact moment. The floor trembled. Something cracked overhead, like the building was being crushed in an invisible fist. The lights flickered. A strange, low sound filled the air. Not a rumble, not a blast, but more like the entire structure had lost balance and begun collapsing inward. People screamed. Someone ran toward me. Others tried to force open blast doors. Too late. The system was switching to autonomous lockdown. Section after section went dark. The ventilation howled like a beast trapped in a cage. And then, the second wave hit. Beams. Right through the ceiling. Not just one, several. Pillars of light tearing upward through the structure. As if lifting pieces of the earth itself. But they weren't destroying. They were extracting. Made of energy, they moved from sector to sector, precisely, surgically, carving out modules, people, data. They were erasing, without wreckage. They were cleansing. I understood then. This wasn't revenge. It was a purge. To make sure no one ever again tried to dissect a humanoid body. I fell, literally, as the floor beneath me collapsed. Another beam having torn out an entire segment. I tumbled down a sloped shaft, coated in dust and cables, choking on clouds of smoke. And then, from nowhere, a window appeared. An oval in the air. Not a door, not a hatch. Space itself folded inward. Inside, light, warmth, calm. I didn't think. I leapt. The fall stopped instantly. My body hovered weightlessly, then gently lowered onto a metallic floor. Not our metal, smooth, seamless, warm. I was aboard. Aboard their ship. In front of me, a white corridor stretching into the distance. Light, without a source. Walls without seams. Silence, near absolute. Behind me, the portal sealed shut, and beneath it, the remains of what had once been Zone 52. They had erased it, and they had saved me. "Welcome," a voice said. "We're glad you're alive." It wasn't in my head. I clearly heard it with my ears, yet there were no speakers, no source of sound. And the voice was entirely human, male, calm, even, almost accentless, flawless. English. The kind you hear from narrators in old science documentaries. I turned around. Standing before me were two figures, Elle and Navi. But they were no longer the isolated beings from the concrete chamber. They wore something like white cloaks, seamless and claspless. Their skin glowed faintly from within, a soft, warm light. They looked restored. Whole. Younger? Navi stepped forward. His lips didn't move, but the voice was his. "Yes. We can speak. We've always been able to doubt. We were just listening." "Why?" I asked, barely getting the word out. "Why not sooner?" Elle raised a hand. The gesture was almost apologetic. "We couldn't be sure who you were, what you wanted, how you'd react if you found out we understood everything that we needed to observe. You were waiting." I paused, my head spinning. "You were spying?" Navi slowly shook his head. "We were studying. As you were studying us, equal terms." I sank onto a bench that slid out from the wall, as if sensing my state. "And Jazz?" I asked. "He died. You knew they were going to dissect him." "We knew," said Elle. "And we allowed it. He was ready. It was a choice. We are not immortal. But we know how to leave something behind." "You did leave something." "A bio key." I saw the scientists' reaction. They understood nothing. "But you did," Navi said, watching me closely. "And you chose to act. You disobeyed orders to help." "Why?" I didn't have an answer right away. "Because you were real," I said at last. "Not test subjects. Not specimens. Just alive. And I couldn't stand to watch you being cut open." Silence settled between us. Then Elle stepped closer, and something in his gaze reminded me of people. Real people. He crouched so his eyes were level with mine. "That makes you different, not better. Just real." I looked at them both. "So what now?" "You have a choice," said Navi. "We can take you with us, show you more, teach you. There's so much beyond Earth you can't yet imagine." He raised a hand. In his palm, an image appeared. A planetary system, rings, strange fractal structures. "Or we return you to Earth, anywhere you wish, with a new identity. The freedom to live as you choose. Whichever you decide," Elle added, "will be final. That we don't come back twice." I stayed silent for a long time. They didn't rush me. Faces came to mind, the remnants of the underground complex, the lab, those years, and everything I'd lost, and everything I could gain. Not knowledge, not technology, but clarity, freedom. Honestly, I said, I don't want to be part of anything hidden anymore. That I don't need eternity. Just a real life is enough. They nodded. Where do you want to live? Navi asked. That I smiled. Colombia. Mountains. That I know the place. Elle looked at Navi, and between them passed a wordless agreement. Very well. Documents, identity, financial autonomy. It'll all be arranged. That you'll go through a humanity verification. Formality. I couldn't tell if he was joking. What happens to me? People will ask. They'll find out. Navi shook his head. Zone no longer exists. All data erased. All witnesses either gone or reconsidered. You're the exception, said Elle, because you chose to be human when others chose to watch. They extended their hands to me, and this time I shook them. Money, Navi echoed. Is it important? Hard to live without it. I shrugged. You've already helped with the documents. But I still need a way to live. The world doesn't spin for free. They exchanged a glance, not disapproval or doubt this time, but something like analytical curiosity, as if this was the last unknown variable in their equation. How much? I don't know. I hesitated. Enough for a quiet life. Nothing fancy, just no struggle. Maybe $150,000. Physical funds? Paper, preferably, yes. Transfers can be traced. Cash is cleaner. Elle nodded, turned, and walked deeper into the ship. I was left with Navi, and suddenly the air around us changed. Like static. Charged. What are you about to do? Redistribute value, he said calmly. Quickly. Efficiently. It won't affect the global balance. Just an adaptation of the system to your need. I couldn't tell if he was joking. But a few minutes later, Elle returned, holding a small bag. He opened it in front of me. Inside, stacks of crisp new bills. Bundles of 10,000 each. Bank bands. Still sealed. Federal Reserve Branch, Elle said. Night cycle. Gravlift. Moved fast. Security was outdated. I just stared at the money. Then at them. Did you just rob a bank for me? No, Navi replied. We corrected a gap. You asked, we fulfilled. The rest is your responsibility. I smirked. A very human reaction. Well, I guess I owe you. No, said Elle. We're even. You made a choice. So did we. Colombia greeted me. With sunshine. No interrogations, no customs, no paperwork hell. Just warm wind, a new identity, and clean documents. David Arrieta. Citizen. Spotless history. Work visa first, then permanent residency. I settled in a small hillside town where everyone knows everyone, but no one asks questions. At the edge of town, a lab where I'm listed as a consultant. Simple work. Support for ongoing research. Routine chemistry. But for me, it's a breath of life. In the evenings, I sit on my rooftop and watch the twilight sweep over the jungle. Somewhere, a night bird sings. The air smells like flowers and ozone. The sky, clear. No satellites. No surveillance. They said they wouldn't come back. And I believe them. That I don't wait for signals anymore. Don't follow neon glimmers. Or chase alien footprints. My past lies deep underground. In a cell where 3 silent beings taught us how to be human. I passed the test. Not by their standards. By mine. Now I just live. No fear. No systems. No protocols. Sometimes I wonder, I could have gone with them. Seen other stars. Other worlds. But why? When you're given a real choice, a true one, you don't need to run into the stars. Sometimes it's enough just to be here on Earth.